December 8, 1941. Tokyo was celebrating. Newspapers were rushing into the streets with black headlines. Officers were shaking hands in rooms thick with cigarette smoke. The radio reports from Hawaii sounded impossible to believe. Battleships burning. Aircraft wrecked on the ground. The American Pacific Fleet caught at anchor on a Sunday morning. To the men around Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, it looked like genius. To Yamamoto, it looked like a clock starting. Not a victory clock, a factory clock. He had given Japan the first blow because his country had chosen a war he did not believe it could win. He had designed the attack with terrifying skill. He knew exactly what had happened at Pearl Harbor. But he also knew what had not happened. America had not been broken. America had been unified, and the country Japan had just awakened was not merely a navy, not merely a president, not merely a flag. It was rail yards, oil fields, shipyards, tool rooms, machine presses, and men who could turn a drawing on paper into steel by morning. Yamamoto knew that because he had seen it. Long before Pearl Harbor, before the war maps, before the admirals around him convinced themselves that courage could bend arithmetic, Yamamoto had walked through the country Japan was now trying to defeat. He had crossed American streets as a young officer. He had studied in American classrooms. He had watched American factories work like living organisms. And what he learned there followed him for the rest of his life, not as admiration, as dread. Isoroku Yamamoto was born in 1884 in Nagaoka, the son of a former samurai family living in a country that had spent half a century trying to become modern before the West could turn it into prey. Japan's rise had taught its officers a dangerous lesson. Speed worked, discipline worked, surprise worked. Japan had defeated China. Japan had shocked Russia at Tsushima. Japan had built a navy that could make European powers treat it with caution. Yamamoto had been part of that rise almost from the beginning. At Tsushima in 1905, he served near the guns when an explosion tore into his position and took 2 fingers from his left hand. He was barely 20. He survived, kept serving, and became the kind of officer Japan valued most. Brave enough for battle, but calm enough to think beyond it. He studied English. He studied naval theory. He studied oil. That last subject mattered more than almost anyone around him understood. Modern war did not run on slogans. It ran on fuel. A fleet without oil was not a fleet. It was painted metal waiting beside a pier. So in 1919, the Japanese Navy sent Yamamoto to the United States to study at Harvard. The assignment was supposed to educate him. It did more than that. It gave him a look behind the curtain. America in 1919 did not look like an exhausted nation after a war. It looked like an engine that had discovered a higher gear. Yamamoto arrived in a country that seemed too large to measure cleanly from a map. Boston was only the beginning. There were docks crowded with cargo, trains moving through the night, immigrant neighborhoods packed with languages he could not count, banks financing distant industries, universities training engineers, and newspapers arguing openly about everything. That openness unsettled many foreign officers. Yamamoto noticed something else. Arguments did not stop the production. The country could be noisy, divided, careless, and politically chaotic, and still pour out steel, oil, food, trucks, rifles, locomotives, and ships at a scale Japan could not touch. That was the first lesson. America did not need to look disciplined to be dangerous. He traveled beyond Harvard whenever he could. He watched the industrial Northeast breathe smoke into the sky. He saw rail lines stitched across distances that would have swallowed whole Japanese provinces. He studied oil and understood that Texas, California, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania were not just places. They were strategic organs. To Japanese planners, oil was a problem. To America, it was a landscape. Yamamoto looked at the American mainland and saw something his more aggressive colleagues refused to see. Japan was an island empire trying to become a continental power without continental resources. America was a continental power that could afford to be slow at first because once it moved with the weight of a continent. He learned poker while he was there. That detail sounds small. It is not. Poker suited Yamamoto because it punished wishful thinking. You could bluff for a while. You could frighten a weaker man. You could win a hand you did not deserve. But over time, the cards and the money revealed the truth. A gambler who mistook a lucky opening for a winning position eventually lost to the player with the deeper stack. Yamamoto understood that. Japan, he believed, could win hands against America. It could not win the table. In 1926, he returned to the United States as a naval attaché in Washington. This time he did not come as a student. He came as a professional observer. He looked at shipyards. He listened to politicians. He spoke with businessmen. He traveled through a country still confident enough to underestimate itself. That confidence mattered. Americans argued constantly about isolation, taxes, labor, presidents, bankers, and immigrants. They seemed divided in a way Japanese militarists mistook for weakness. Yamamoto read it differently. A country that could argue like that and still build like that was not brittle. It was flexible. If struck hard enough, it would not necessarily crack. It might align. He also understood geography. Japan's planners liked clean arrows. They loved maps where fleets moved across blue space and islands fell one after another. They could imagine perimeter lines, decisive battles, negotiated settlements. But America was not a perimeter. America was depth. The Pacific alone was a logistical nightmare. Then came the West Coast, mountain ranges, deserts, plains, rivers, farms, the Great Lakes, and the industrial East. There was no single hinge. No one harbor whose capture would make the country kneel. No capital city whose fall would make the whole system stop breathing. The Japanese army had learned how to break governments. Yamamoto had seen a country that was harder to break than a government. That distinction would haunt him. By the late 1930s, Japan was moving toward a war path so steep that even men who recognized the danger struggled to step off it. China had become a grinding war. The army had grown politically untouchable. The Navy feared being trapped by American and British pressure. Oil was the choke point. Japan imported much of the fuel that made its fleet possible. When Washington tightened pressure and embargoes began to threaten that supply, the strategic debate narrowed into something fatal. Either retreat from expansion or seize resources in Southeast Asia. But seizing those resources meant risking war with the United States. Yamamoto's position was not sentimental. He was not a pacifist. He was not soft. He was not secretly loyal to America. He was a Japanese admiral doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic was brutal. Japan could strike first. Japan could hit hard. Japan could take territory quickly. But if the war became long, Japan would be pulled into a contest of fuel, steel, pilot training, shipping, repair capacity, food, submarines, replacement parts, and time. And in that contest, Japan was not merely disadvantaged. It was doomed. When Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe asked whether Japan could fight the United States, Yamamoto's answer was famous because it was so cold. For 6 months, perhaps a year, he could run wild. After that, he could promise nothing. That was not humility. That was the limit of the card table. He knew Japan's opening hand. He also knew America's stack. The tragedy is that some men heard him clearly and still kept walking toward war. They believed America was soft. They believed Americans would not tolerate casualties. They believed a spectacular opening strike could shock Washington into negotiation. They believed Japanese spirit could compensate for oil, steel, and time. Inside that belief was the oldest military error in the world. They confused willingness to die with capacity to win. Yamamoto did not win the debate. By 1941, the question had changed. It was no longer, should Japan fight America? It was, how can Japan survive the opening phase of a war against America? Yamamoto's answer became Pearl Harbor. That is what makes his story so difficult. The man who warned against the war planned the attack that began it for the United States. Not because he had changed his mind. Because his country chose the war anyway, and once it did, he believed Japan's only chance was to cripple the American fleet before it could move. A bad decision had been made above him. He tried to make the first move inside that bad decision as effective as possible. On December 7th in Hawaii, the attack achieved tactical surprise. The damage was enormous. The shock was national. The dead were real. But the central target Yamamoto needed most was not destroyed. The American aircraft carriers were not in the harbor. The repair yards survived. The fuel storage survived. The submarine base survived. And even if all of them had burned, the deeper problem would have remained. Pearl Harbor could damage ships. It could not bomb the factories that would replace them. It could not sink Detroit. It could not torpedo Pittsburgh. It could not set fire to the oil fields of Texas. It could not stop the machine tools already waiting in American plants. Within months, the war Yamamoto feared began to take its real shape. At first, Japan still looked unstoppable. Wake Island fell. Hong Kong fell. Malaya collapsed with stunning speed. Singapore, the British fortress, surrendered. Japanese carriers roamed the Pacific like knives in dark water. To the public, it looked like proof that the militarists had been right. To Yamamoto, it looked like the 6-month window, and the window was closing. Then came the Coral Sea. Then Midway. At Midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single battle. They were not just ships. They were floating systems. Aircraft trained pilots, deck crews, mechanics, doctrine, confidence, and years of accumulated skill. Japan could build more hulls slowly. It could not easily replace the veteran naval airmen lost across those months. America could. That difference mattered more than any speech. American factories did not respond to Midway with relief. They responded with acceleration. In 1941, the United States produced more than 26,000 aircraft. By 1944, it produced more than 96,000 in a single year. Japan's best year never reached 30,000. That is not a statistic. That is the sound of Yamamoto's warning becoming metal. Factories that once built cars began building bombers. Shipyards that once seemed busy became almost unnatural. Workers learned faster methods, split tasks into smaller steps, and turned mass production into a military weapon. The Liberty Ship program made cargo vessels by assembly line. The Essex-class carriers began entering service in numbers Japan could not answer. Airfields trained pilots faster than Japan could replace them. The war had become the exact contest Yamamoto had tried to avoid. Not one battle, a ledger, and every month the ledger moved further against Japan. This is why the fantasy of striking the American mainland was never a serious answer. A raid was possible. A nuisance was possible. A symbolic landing in remote territory was possible. But an invasion that could force the United States to submit, that belonged to maps, not reality. The Pacific Supply Line alone would have devoured the plan. Fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, replacements, escort ships, transports, landing craft, and air cover would have to cross thousands of miles of ocean while American submarines and aircraft learned the routes. Even if Japanese troops somehow reached the West Coast in force, what then? They would not have reached the end of America. They would have reached the beginning of it. Mountains behind the coast. Deserts beyond the mountains. Rail lines feeding armies from the interior, factories far outside the reach of Japanese guns, a population now enraged by Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto did not need a patriotic slogan to understand the result. He had already seen the map. He had already seen the factories. He had already seen the oil. The Aleutian campaign showed the scale of the problem in miniature. In 1942, Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska, cold, remote islands in the far North Pacific. The operation had symbolic value. It placed Japanese troops on American territory. But symbolism could not feed men. Weather punished both sides. Distance punished Japan more. American forces built bases, tightened the blockade, and turned the islands into a frozen lesson in logistics. When U.S. troops retook Attu in 1943, the battle was savage and costly. The Japanese defenders fought almost to extinction. The Americans paid heavily for a place most civilians could not find on a map. Now enlarge that lesson to the mainland. If one barren island at the edge of the weather could cost so much, what would a continent cost? Yamamoto had spent years asking that question before anyone else was willing to answer it honestly. By early 1943, the tide had turned so clearly that even official optimism could not hide it. Guadalcanal had become a wound Japan could not close. Supply destroyers ran at night because daylight belonged increasingly to American aircraft. Japanese soldiers starved in places their commanders had once drawn proudly inside defensive lines. Yamamoto was still commanding, still planning, still working, still serving an empire whose strategy had confirmed his worst fears. That is another painful part of the story. Being right did not free him from duty. he did not resign into purity. He did not stand outside the war as a clean prophet. He fought the war he had warned against, with the same discipline that made his warning credible in the first place. In April 1943, Yamamoto planned an inspection tour through Japanese forward bases in the Solomons. His schedule was transmitted in code. American codebreakers read it. The details were extraordinary. Route, timing, aircraft, escort, destination. Washington faced a decision. Yamamoto was not just any officer. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor and the commander of the combined fleet. The mission was approved. Operation Vengeance. On April 18th, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters lifted off from Guadalcanal and flew a long, low route over open water to avoid detection. They had to arrive almost exactly on time. Not close. Not eventually. Exactly. Over Bougainville, they intercepted Yamamoto's aircraft. The admiral who had understood America better than almost anyone in Japan died in the jungle, shot down by American pilots flying long-range fighters built by the industrial system he had studied decades earlier. History has a cruel talent for symmetry. Yamamoto had crossed America as a young officer to measure its power. That power found him over the Pacific. But his death did not stop the machine. If anything, the worst proof of his warning came after he was gone. In 1944, the United States moved through the Central Pacific with a rhythm Japan could not match. The Marianas became the decisive doorway. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese naval aviation suffered a disaster so one-sided that American pilots gave it a grim nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan sent aircraft and pilots into the sky. Too many never returned. The pilots were brave. Many were committed. Some knew exactly what they were flying into. But bravery could not replace training hours. It could not replace radar direction, damage control, ship numbers, fuel, ammunition, or carrier decks. Yamamoto had warned that numbers would eventually begin to speak. By 1944, they were shouting. Saipan made the ending visible. When American forces took the island, Japan lost more than ground. It lost the shield that had kept the home islands beyond routine bombing range. B-29 airfields could now be built in the Marianas. The war had crossed an invisible boundary. Japan's leaders had once promised their people that the defensive perimeter would hold. Saipan was inside that promise. When it fell, the promise fell with it. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned days later, not because Japan had suddenly discovered the truth, because the truth had finally become too large to hide. From there, the war became a narrowing corridor. Japanese shipping was strangled. Oil routes were cut. Pilots were thrown into one-way tactics because conventional replacements could no longer keep pace. Cities burned. Food grew scarce. The Navy that had opened the war with one of the most brilliant surprise attacks in military history could no longer protect the sea lanes that kept Japan alive. This is what Yamamoto had meant when he warned that Japan could not win a long war. He was not predicting one failed battle. He was predicting a system failure, fuel failure, training failure, production failure, shipping failure, strategic failure, the kind of failure that does not arrive all at once, but month by month, convoy by convoy, carrier by carrier, pilot by pilot. And behind each loss stood the same fact. America could absorb what Japan could not. America lost ships and built more, lost aircraft and trained more pilots, spent ammunition and manufactured more, opened one front and supplied another, fought in Europe and the Pacific at the same time. Japan had gambled that an early shock could change American will. Instead, it changed American mobilization. The most famous myth attached to Yamamoto is the idea that he spoke of waking a sleeping giant. Historians debate the exact line, and the sentence matters less than people think. The real warning was never one poetic quote. The warning was his entire career, his years at Harvard, his time in Washington, his visits to factories and oil centers, his opposition to war, his 6-month estimate, his dread after Pearl Harbor, his understanding that Japan's opening victories could not change the final math. The myth is a line, the truth is a ledger. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Yamamoto had been dead for more than 2 years. He did not see the Emperor's broadcast. He did not see American occupation troops in Tokyo. He did not see the empire collapse back into the islands from which it had tried to dominate the Pacific. But he had seen the ending before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. Not in every detail. No one could have seen every detail. But he saw the direction clearly enough. A war Japan could start but not sustain. A blow Japan could deliver but not survive. A country Japan could anger but not outproduce. That is why Yamamoto's story is more than a story about American power. It is a story about institutions and the truths they refuse to hear. Japan did not go to war because no one understood the risk. Men inside the system understood it. Yamamoto was the most famous, but he was not alone. The warnings existed. The production figures existed. The fuel problem existed. The geography existed. The problem was not absence of information. The problem was that the information demanded a kind of humility the institution could not tolerate. Aggressive systems reward aggressive answers. They promote the men who promise motion. They distrust the men who describe limits. They call caution weakness until reality proves caution was the only courage in the room. Yamamoto had power, but not enough. Status, but not enough. Clarity, but not enough. And clarity without enough institutional power becomes a record for history instead of a brake on catastrophe. After the war, the men who had believed Japan could force its way through the impossible faced a ruined country. Cities burned, fleet gone, merchant shipping shattered, millions dead across Asia and the Pacific. The empire dissolved. The enemy Yamamoto had warned them not to fight now governed the capital. The men who had dismissed the arithmetic had to live or die inside the result of ignoring it. Yamamoto was honored as a hero, but honor did not change the central fact. He had warned them. They chose the myth, and the machine did what machines do. It ran, not with hatred, not with drama, not with speeches, with shifts, schedules, steel, fuel, ledgers, convoys, ship launches, training hours, repair crews, and assembly lines. That is the part of war that romantic minds hate most. The part that does not care how brave you are. Yamamoto understood bravery. He had lived it. But he also understood that bravery is not a substitute for fuel. Sacrifice is not a substitute for production. Spirit is not a substitute for replacement pilots. A perfect opening strike is not a substitute for a winning strategy. That was the truth he carried back from America. That was the truth Japan refused to accept. And that is why the most haunting image of Yamamoto is not him planning Pearl Harbor. It is not him saluting pilots. It is not even his aircraft falling over Bougainville. It is the quiet image before all of it. A Japanese officer standing in America years before the war, watching a factory floor move with calm, ordinary confidence. He was looking at the enemy before the enemy existed, and he understood. The admiral saw the machine. The empire chose the myth, and the machine did not stop.